Okay, so One Piece live action is officially out, and it adapted everything up to Arlong Park, which I'm decently surprised that. I thought that Logtown would be, the most obvious place to end it, considering it kind of is a nice leeway into a season 2, moving on to the Grand Line. But whatever. I have previously said I am not excited for the show and that I think it'll be terrible. So, what did I think? Did it genuinely blow me away and surprise me? Was this a genuinely really good adaptation of one of my all-time favorite series? Or was I right and this is just kind of a boring, stale, lifeless piece of art? Yeah, it's the second one. It's bad, like really, really bad. But not everyone seems to think so. I mean, if you were to look at Twitter, you may even get the impression that it's a really great show. Well, it's not. The few who do criticize it are bombarded with insults and the worst defense imaginable. Oda made it, so shut up. But here's the thing, Oda very well could have had a very prominent role in this show, but that doesn't excuse it of any criticism. If we're not allowed to criticize something simply because Oda had a hand in it, then we shouldn't be allowed to criticize any characters or arcs or even the anime adaptation. We must simply consume and love everything he's made without any thought whatsoever. And I think that's incredibly reductive. If we claim that everything that Oda has made has been perfection to the extreme, then that diminishes the actual moments where he has created perfection. The thing that makes Oda so special is that he creates perfection more often than not. And this live action is far from perfection. So basically, if you're gonna call me a fake One Piece fan, call me that because I don't love Dressrosa or Whole Cake Island as much as a lot of people. Call me that because I think the anime's pacing is really terrible. Call me that because I think One Piece Film Red is genuinely awful. I mean, you'd be dumb for saying it, but I'd respect it a lot more than someone saying I'm a fake One Piece fan because I don't like the terrible live action adaptation of one of the greatest epic fantasies ever made. We'll get into that more in a bit, but first let me explain how I'm planning to approach this review. The showrunners and Oda himself have basically said it's impossible to directly translate this series. That does beg some questions, but fine. I have no intention of reviewing this series as an adaptation. That means I'm going to avoid differences or massive changes to the manga, because honestly, it doesn't really matter. My entire argument has nothing to do with this simply being a bad adaptation, because it's so much more than that. This is straight up just a terrible series. If this didn't have One Piece's name attached to it, then no one would be talking about it. It would simply be another dead show on Netflix that's immediately forgotten. So to really make my point, let's review the show, starting with episode 1. Episode 1 is a rough introduction to the series, and most of that is to do with some really poor direction and just some slow pacing. It's not necessarily a bad episode, though it doesn't put its best foot forward. The Roger scene is fine for the most part. It's a bit stilted and awkward, but something being off isn't the worst thing in the world. Roger's actor has a great voice, though his performance is a bit too Jack Sparrow-esque, though that's barely a complaint. The only real issue I have with the scene is that it doesn't do a great job establishing how and why Roger is so infamous. The rest of the series doesn't really go into it either, so this was their best shot and I feel like they really missed the mark there. But my issues really start when Luffy enters Avantaga's ship and we get our first real scene with Luffy and Koby. The actors are doing a really good job. Inaki, the guy who plays Luffy, is genuinely really charismatic, but there's just something really off about the writing that drags the pacing down. Everything during this entire sequence just looks really rough too. Nothing ever feels lived in and it gives this really phony effect to everything. Our first action scene is a really embarrassing one. The choreography is genuinely terrible and the cinematography is like fine, you can tell what's happening, but it's so uninspired and so dull and unexciting. Whoever decided this poster idea was a good decision, oh my god, why? It's so cheap and weird. I despise it and I can't understand why anyone thought that that was a good idea. Honestly, outside of that, I would go into more detail about the episode, but so much of it is just empty, void of any substance. It lingers around Shellstown and it's cool in concept, but my god does it drag. Once again, the scenes are fine in concept, but they just take forever to get to where they need to go. I do really want to compliment Helmeppo. He was genuinely so much fun and cartoonish in the best way possible.
Though I will say it is a bit weird having him and this entire sequence played out just after Zoro hauled his severed body into a bar like it's nothing. I know he's a bounty hunter, but like, bro, chill. He does nothing this brutal ever again, and it just feels out of place for the type of whimsy and awe they're trying to go for. Especially when this kid just runs up to him and does this. Go away. It's not a big deal, but it's just kind of this tonal whiplash that doesn't really fit well together. But honestly, most of this entire middle section is fine. It's slow and uneventful in a lot of ways, but I wouldn't say it's terrible TV, just kind of slow. I enjoyed the Luffy and Nami dynamic. The actors have charisma and they bounce off each other well. I do find this scene with Axe Hand Morgan really weird, where she calls Luffy a prisoner and yet he has no cuffs on him and everyone is just cool with it. It's not a big deal, but you know, it's small little things like that that just feel off. The real issues only really arrive at the end, where they have their big battle and it's just lame as hell. There are no interesting shots to speak of. The actors and stuntmen are clearly putting in the work, but with bad framing, none of it works. It gets real bad with Axe and Morgan, where they randomly add this 4-way camera split that just looks terrible and does not fit at all. The show does this a few times and every single time it's out of place and awkward. There's a bunch of weird moments in this fight, like when Zoro uses his iconic 3-sword style move to never use the third sword. Like, ever. The closest we get is holding his sword to Axe Hand Morgan's throat, and that's about it. Things get so much worse after this, with really bad slow-mo effect and even more editing errors just point blank. Axe Hand is pushed and is clearly about to roll back, but it cuts and he just lands face first. This is just really bad work across the board, and no, they don't get an excuse. This cost about the same as the final seasons of Game of Thrones. It should look a lot better. This is a problem with the entire production of this show. Everything looks hollow and nothing ever feels lived in. There's clearly a lot of talent here that's unfortunately hurt by some really bad direction. It's not a terrible episode by any means, but it's definitely not good either. I would say it's just kind of below average. If the pacing was a lot tighter, I could excuse some of the other stuff, but as it stands now, it's just kind of bland. Episode 2 is a step up from the first, even though I think it suffers from many of the same issues. The show just lingers on scenes that really don't need it. I was honestly really surprised by Garp and Buggy this episode. They're very different from their manga counterparts, but the actors deliver some really strong performances and even made me laugh a few times.
Was that before or after you let them steal a map to the Grand Line?
The circus stuff with Buggy was mostly fun. I didn't really have many big issues with it, it's just kind of pacing and all that sort of stuff. Though I do want to call out one really weird issue where we're introduced to Buggy's crew, and then when Zoro and Nami are captured, they beat up one of them and then they just say that the rest were beaten as well. It's a small issue, I know, but it's just really weird that they decided to go down this route. The biggest issue I have with this plot is the moment where Zoro says this.
Didn't used to think so. But Luffy changed that.
That simpleton in a straw hat. Don't tell me you actually believe in him.
I don't need to. He believes in himself.
I really don't believe in Zoro, Nami and Luffy's friendship. It's all very forced and sudden. Nami gets more of a pass because you can argue she's pretending, but it still doesn't help Zoro's case. But aside from those issues, most of the present day stuff was fun enough to keep me entertained. Unfortunately, the episode keeps throwing us into these terrible flashback sequences with Luffy. Luffy's flashback was also in episode 1, but as we get the conclusion in episode 2, I thought it'd be best to discuss it here. These flashback sequences are so weak, doing very little to have us care about Luffy or Shanks. Every time we flashback, it feels like the weakest aspects of the show are heightened tenfold. I know this is comparing it to the manga, but this is what I mean by lifeless direction. Two of the most iconic scenes in One Piece are Shanks saving Luffy and losing his arm, and Shanks giving Luffy his hat, both of which are just butchered here. Come on, not even the most diehard live action fan can tell me that this is a good adaptation of this scene. There's nothing special about either of these shots. Yeah, they point the camera at the actors and you can tell what's going on, but they're just so lifeless and it's so upsetting when you know how good this could look. So yeah, that's pretty much everything I have to say about episode 2. Aside from Garp and Buggy, this episode doesn't really bring much to the table. It's fine for the most part, although you know, the pacing does drag it out and these flashback sequences are really bad. It's probably got the most fun action scene with the Straw Hats trapping Buggy's limbs in these chests and whatnot, even though the CG does look really rough, but it's fine, whatever. Alright, so episodes 3 and 4 are going to be combined here because it comes off more as a two-parter and most of my critiques carry over naturally to each other. Let me start off by saying that this arc is straight up just kind of bad in the manga. Syrup Village is arguably One Piece's weakest arc, and
I was kinda really interested to see how the live action would handle it for that simple reason. I would obviously have less attachment and care for how they would evolve and change things here, so I was more willing to give it a shot. In many ways, this was the live action's best chance to capture me. And honestly, to start with, it did a pretty decent job. Usopp's actor is great. He's really fun and charming, but I think he did a really good job at keeping some of those more reserved elements of the character. I genuinely feel he stole every scene he was in. I had a lot of fun with him. It sucks then that this arc is unfortunately so much worse than in the manga. Despite how much fun I had with the actor, Usopp has nothing to do in this arc. His arc. The entire point of this is to show us why he's worthy of being a main character and joining the crew, and yet here he's barely a side character. Instead, this is Zoro's arc, and the times where Usopp could be helping most, Nami replaces him.
I'd be so disappointed. No, they'd want you to survive. And that is exactly what we are going to do.
Why is she the one helping Kaya here? It should be him. I mean, she can provide some assistance, but he should be the main heart of this entire segment. Honestly, most of episode 3 is just slow, with the pacing getting worse each episode. So much of it is just silence that adds nothing to the table. I would be complaining about it more, but we end up getting something so much worse. Kuro and his companions suck. This is the best costume they could come up with. It's so bad. This lazy town looking villain, but without any of the charisma, comes waltzing in and just takes up so much time. The performances are so bad and the writing just gets worse and cringier with every waking second. Why do they hiss? It's so unthreatening, and yet Zoro gets knocked out by a wine bottle to the head. This is a guy who was able to lift this up, and in the very next episode lives after being struck by Mihawk, who canonically in this show is able to do this to ships. Worst of all, they don't even kill him. Did these idiots think a wine bottle killed him? Slit his throat! It's right there! Just do something! If you ever feel incompetent, just remember that this went through so many millionaires, billionaires even. This went through so many people who all said, yeah, this is good. And I know someone's gonna go into a comment and say, stop nitpicking. I'm sorry, but this isn't nitpicking. This is just calling out how ridiculously stupid the logic in this show is. Everything about this episode is so terrible, from the designs of the villains to the mind-numbingly stupid logic to them wasting a chance to set up an entire character properly. Episode 4 is somehow worse. We spend more time with these villains than we do Usopp. All the while, Kobe's entire plotline simply exists to drag everything out. Seriously, Kobe's plotline adds nothing to Luffy's journey. He barely adds anything to his own. He does nothing but stretch out a series that really doesn't need to be stretched out. One Piece is plenty long enough, guys. Action scenes get worse than ever, with Luffy vs Kuro being an embarrassing use of CG direction and acting. Zoro versus this Batman and Catwoman cosplay just has me cringing with every hiss. Please stop hissing. Jesus Christ. The episode also involves Zoro's flashback, and yeah, it's just really weak. Laughably, I'd say it's probably the best bit of the entire episode, which is saying something. We also get our first introduction to Arlong, and it's genuinely beautiful. For some unknown reason, he comes in with a hip-hop beat, and I can't help but laugh. The fishman genuinely looks so stupid. It's so bad it's good. Like, oh my god, I die every time they come on screen. It's 10 out of 10 comedy. Every line Arlong says genuinely sounds like it's a producer tag, and it gets me every time. I genuinely love it. It's chef's kiss. I would not change it for the world. This series is 100% justified. Season 2, bring it on.
To remind you of your place in the food chain.
But yeah, that's episode 3 and 4, which consists of the Syrup Village arc, and it's genuinely terrible. This is rock bottom. Like, oh my god, I can't believe that it ever got this bad. It looks worse than ever. The writing is just terrible, especially when it comes to the villains. And unfortunately, the actors who are really good don't get any time, like, to really shine. And it's just upsetting. Overall, terrible episode. Worst of the worst, unfortunately. And this is rock bottom. Let's move on. Episode 5 is a huge step up, which isn't saying much because anything would have been a step up from that, and episode 5 is also just bad, but still, it's a step up. I was honestly having fun with the crew in Baratie. They were decent and I actually enjoyed this little quirk with Zoro struggling to sit with his swords. Sanji was a nice surprise. I thought I'd dislike him just because I knew they were going to change him most, and whilst I don't vibe with the, blank boy vibes, I still actually really enjoyed his performance. The chef scene was fun and his introduction to the crew had a natural pace that fit. Other than that though, this episode once again just drags. It takes so long for anything to happen. We get this one good scene with Sanji and Luffy, and Sanji feeds this starved pirate. It's good and it's genuinely the best cinematography in the entire show. It's just got this cozy vibe and I just really enjoyed it. I also kinda like the Zoro and Nami drinking game, but the pacing is really off. It also doesn't help that Zoro's actor is unfortunately the weakest link. Now don't get me wrong, I'm sure the actor is very good, but it genuinely feels like he's not allowed to express any emotion. He's clearly a talented martial artist, but it seems the showrunners are obsessed with making Zoro look cool. And it's just weird because Zoro is already cool, he doesn't need any help. It takes 30 minutes for something of actual substance to really happen when Mihawk enters the Baratie, leading to one of the most awkward scenes in the entire show, which is saying something. This is such a weak moment where Zoro challenges Mihawk because there's no real setup for any of this.
I've been following your career since I was a child, which is why it pains me to inform you that tomorrow you're going to die.
It comes off so weird to find out that this is Zoro's greatest challenge without any valuable setup to make it worthwhile. Also, side note, but my god does this show love a close-up. They want you to see every pore on these guys' faces. Pull the camera back and chill with the focus. Every scene looks like a Bethesda game and it's so weird. I don't need to look up the guy's nose. Jesus Christ. How would you feel if every time I cut to myself it was like this? Notice how stilted I am. Yeah. I have to stay like this. I can't move. Reason why is because if I move like this, I'm out of frame and everything looks really damn awkward. Stop doing this. So straight up, the Mihawk fight is terrible. There's an awful jump cut that's supposed to look like super speed that's just so bad. So I just want to make it clear, I did not edit this. This is genuinely what it looks like. Someone thought that that was acceptable. It ends with this terrible CG shot of the swords breaking, and I'm genuinely shocked that this was allowed in. The moment with Zoro's speech where he vows to be a swordsman is unfortunately just really rough.
I will never lose again!
Once again, I don't blame the actor, but man, this is genuinely bad. And this actually brings me to two issues I really just want to call out. I've seen a lot of people making fun of IGN for claiming that the real problem with this show is sticking too close to the source material. And there's something I want to say here. They really do have a point. I know, it sounds insane. Every time a live action adaptation comes out, people typically make the criticism that the real problem with it is that it doesn't stick to the source material. And here we're saying it shouldn't stick to the source material, which I get it, it sounds weird, but the issue with this entire Zoro and Mihawk sequence is that it does stick to the source material without taking any of the important context that makes the source material work. Why do Zoro and Mihawk fight in this adaptation? Because they fight in the original source material, so it needs to happen here, but they didn't take any of the important context that makes that scene work. In the manga, we completely understand why he needs to face Mihawk, and yet in this adaptation, he kind of just faces him and announces that he is his goal right then and there. It just comes off as super awkward. I mean, in the context of the live action, what reason do they have to accept Usopp? He doesn't do anything to prove that he's a worthy member of the crew. The only reason he joins is because he joins in the manga. And in the context of the series, it comes off as especially cruel to abandon Kaya, considering in this show there are no kids and Mary is dead and Kaya is still sick. And even in a scene I like where Sanji feeds this starved pirate, this is supposed to be Jin, and it basically adds nothing to the story because they could have done this exact same scene with Zoro in the next episode. I know this was a bit of a tangent, and yes, it is comparing it to the manga, but I'm not comparing it to say, hey, this is better. I'm comparing it to say that there was no reason for them to take these certain elements if they're already going to change so much here. So anyway, I hope I explained that well enough to get the point across. There is another massive issue in this show that this episode really highlights, and that's just how lifeless this world is. You're telling me that two guys are allowed to have a full-on sword fight without a single soul in sight? Zeph, Sanji, anyone. I know a lot of people would consider that to be nitpicking, but genuinely it speaks to a massive issue with this series that I'll talk about more in a bit. Overall, regardless of how bad and boring I found so much of this episode, it unironically may be one of the strongest in this entire season, which is kinda sad, but also just true. A lot of this episode is kinda wonky, but I do enjoy the actors, and this episode has the most of them getting to interact, so it gets a bit more of a positive, I guess. Episode 6 is by far the strongest episode this season. I was honestly surprised by Sanji and Zeph. All of their scenes were incredibly well acted, and the writing for them was the strongest by far. Whilst it wasn't perfect, this was one of the few times where I felt that the flashbacks were genuinely pretty solid. I really like the scene where Luffy is telling Sanji all of the foods that Zoro likes. I really bought into this desperation that Luffy was feeling and this coziness that Sanji brings with him. I also enjoyed all the stuff with Zoro. It even leads to the most Luffy-esque scene in the entire show, and it's just really cute. I had a lot of fun with it. Honestly, I would really like to keep the review just at that. If every episode had scenes that good, then I wouldn't be complaining about this series. I would be hyping it up, I would be cheering, I would be making a video saying I was wrong about One Piece. But then, unfortunately, MC Arlong hits the scene.
Who's hungry?
Ooh. He's so sick. I feel so bad for the Fishmen actors. The prosthetics are appreciated, but you can tell how much it hinders their performance. It all looks so terrible as well, and we can hardly get an emotion out of them. It makes everything so laughable. A lot of people would say it's the best you're gonna get for live action, and I would say if this is the best, then don't make it. It's not like Netflix was held at gunpoint, forced to make this live action. This is what they have to work with, then I get to criticize it. Now, honestly, whilst this entire segment was really bad, I'm not going to complain about it too much because I'd rather save it for the end, and most of their scenes are just, really bad action scenes. They really suck, but what more do you expect at this point? Honestly, this is their strongest episode. Obviously, the Fishmen suck and they're so laughable, but at least it's in a so bad it's good way. But I wouldn't say that they entirely diminish how good the Sanji and Luffy scenes are. So, hey, good job. Yeah, I kinda like this one. Okay, so just like episode 3 and 4, I'm gonna be compiling my review of episodes 7 and 8 together, considering they are the same arc and my criticisms do flow naturally between them too. So with that being said, if Syrup Village was rock bottom, then Arlong Park is beneath bedrock. This is genuinely such an embarrassing ending, I can't believe Netflix allowed this to be on their site. So much of this finale, just like every episode before it, could have been cut down to the smallest degree and made for a tighter narrative. There is so much empty space here that adds nothing to the story. So much nothing that only seeks to extend the runtime. Every time Koby is on screen, I ask myself what purpose it's supposed to serve, and every single time I find that the answer is nothing. Arlong as a villain gets worse every waking second. Look at him. There's nothing interesting or captivating about him. He's simply just there and screams a couple times and that's about it. For some reason during his speech, there are all these random jump cuts.
Flags of surrender. Willing defeat. Don't know about you.
I don't know if it's supposed to be a stylistic choice, like he loses himself in his anger so it jumps around, but it does not come off like that. Genuinely, it all feels like a massive editing error. Most of episode 7 is horrible filler that adds nothing to the story, just so that we can get to the most important part in this entire season. This is where I'm going to break my rule, because yes, I'm going to talk about the manga because this is really important. See, in the manga, Luffy is the one that draws these characters out of their shells. He forces Zoro to join his crew so he can reach his dream. He builds confidence in Usopp to act rather than cower, and he inspires Sanji to leave Baratie and chase the All Blue. All of these moments lead to the most satisfying moment, where Nami finally learns to accept help and Luffy puts the hat on her. See, in the manga, Luffy rarely ever does any of this directly. He isn't trying to inspire or even necessarily help any of these characters. He just does. He's not inspirational the way Superman is. He's more like a natural storm that blows in and sweeps everyone up into his beliefs, which is what makes this Nami scene so perfect. So, why am I mentioning the manga? Well, it's because the series wants to pretend it's been doing that this entire time, but it hasn't.
at all. He's more classically inspirational the way Superman is, and yet they still play out this same scene, where Luffy refuses to help until she asks, except in this case, he comes off as incredibly inept and in many ways cruel. Every scene before this has shown Luffy acts heroically regardless, so why wouldn't he just, go and beat Arlong up then and there? And once again, what I'm suggesting is technically less accurate to his manga counterpart, but it's far more consistent with the character that's built up in this show. I'm not complaining about the scene because it's different to the manga, I'm complaining about it because it makes no sense in the context of the show. The series ends on this awfully choreographed fight that just straight up looks terrible, but that's not really what annoys me so much about this finale. What really annoys me is that this is a series that simply wants to wear the skin of something incredible without any of the heart. The show tries to replicate the incredible village moment with Nami, but it swaps the order and ruins the context of everything. Luffy says,
"This is our fight."
But then immediately the villagers are nowhere to be seen. They have zero involvement in the show, which actually goes to a huge problem with this adaptation. Genzo, the pinwheel hat guy, he doesn't wear a pinwheel hat in this adaptation, but Genzo and Nami's sister, Nojiko, are pivotal characters in Arlong Park that give us a lot of information on Nami, the island, and set up just how terrible Arlong is. Yet here, they're nothing characters. The series has lured people into thinking that this is a good adaptation for the most surface level reasons. Shanks has red hair, Luffy says Gum Gum, they mention Noland, oh my god, it's all so accurate. But none of it holds any actual importance. Don't get me wrong, it's really cool that it's there, but that's not what makes One Piece what it is. That's entirely based on the heart and soul of every island the crew goes to. One Piece's success is so rampant because of the world in it, the aesthetics, the cultures, and the incredible characters that follow. Arlong Park isn't just great because of Nami and Luffy, it's great because of Genzo and Nezuko, because of Bellamy, because of the villagers. Those are the real heroes. And that's what makes One Piece so special, that in spite of giants and sea beasts and islands made out of cake or even a rubber boy, the series is ultimately about humanity coming together. And yet here, it's all about a stretchy boy punching a fish. It doesn't matter about the human quality, as long as Luffy can stretch, it's One Piece. And I can't think of anything more depressing. I know I said I wouldn't be talking about the manga, but when do we draw the line? When do we say, hey, you've changed so much of the original series already, why even have One Piece's name attached to it? Because don't get me wrong, this series sucks regardless. Sure, it's not the worst thing I've ever seen, but is that really a good thing? Are we happy? Are we satisfied with mediocrity? Because it's pretty bad in a lot of cases, and the best it's ever is kinda okay, but none of that I would consider to be a worthy trade-off. And no, I do not care that Oda says he was attached to this, because honestly, after having seen the series, I do not believe it for a single second. The guy has been very open about not being that involved with the anime, and of course he's going to say he's attached to this because marketing, obviously. But even then, if Oda was attached to the series the way they say he was, if Oda even sat down and wrote the scripts and directed everything himself, it shouldn't be blasphemy to say he failed. But here's the thing, I still love Oda, I still love One Piece, I love the current arc and I love where we're going. I just hate this adaptation, the same way I dislike the anime's pacing, the same way I dislike Film Red, the same way I dislike all the One Piece games. I'm upset, but definitely not surprised to see Netflix butchered one of the greatest epic fantasy stories ever written. So that's the end of the video, but before I wrapped up, I just wanted to ask you One Piece live action fans a quick question. Well, like multiple, but would you be satisfied with just this season? I don't mean that in an insulting way, but more of in a logical way. Netflix has a massive history of cancelling shows, and this series cost a whole lot, and One Piece is a massive, massive series. I really wouldn't be surprised if it barely makes it past season 2. Or even if it gets to season 2. That's why I want to know, are you happy with just getting season 1 of this adaptation and leaving it at that? But let's say we do end up getting a season 2. Do you still think that Netflix will be able to continue delivering each season? For how long and how many seasons do they make? Because let's say we end up getting a season a year, which is unfortunately becoming more uncommon. How many seasons do you think they need to make for this series? How long do they go on for? What happens if an actor wants to quit, or the showrunners? I know I threw a bunch of what ifs, but this is genuinely what goes through my head. Whenever I think about this series being incredible, I still get annoyed at the thought that it would be cancelled eventually. Or even worse, it gets rushed to hell. But yeah, that's it. That's all I had to say. I hope the actors get better stuff in future projects. I hope the crew are being treated well, because
My god, they must be dealing with a lot for very little reward, and I hope we can all go back to just gushing about what truly matters. Oda and his masterpiece manga. Thank you guys so much for watching, and if you liked the video, please remember to subscribe and leave a like, as it really does help us out. What did you think of my review? Do you agree with some points, disagree with others? What are your general thoughts? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks a lot, guys. Have a great day, and, peace.